Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Lily James heads up an all-star cast as she pays a visit to the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society. In 1946, writer Juliet Ashton, played by Lily James, is promoting her latest book when she receives a letter from Dorsey Adams, played by Michael Heisman, a member of the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society, founded by Elizabeth McKenna, played by Jessica Brown Finlay, when their group was caught breaking curfew during the Nazi occupation of the island. A curious Juliet travels to meet the society, including fellow members Penelope Wilson's Amelia, Catherine Parkinson's Isola, Tom Courtenay's Eben Ramsey, and his grandson Eli, Papa Kit Connor, with the intention of writing an article about them, but discovers that Elizabeth is missing. Juliet stays, believing there is more to this story as she investigates what happened to Elizabeth and learns that for the people of Guernsey, the scars of the Second World War have not healed. Easily a contender for the longest title of the year, the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society, or Guernsey as I'll call it for short to save myself the effort, is based on a 2008 book of the same name by Mary Ann Schaefer and Anne Barrows. Schaefer wrote the main body of the work, but sadly she fell very ill while it was being re-edited before publishing, hence Barrows stepped in to rewrite those sections and thus is credited as a co-author. Most sadly of all, Schaefer passed away the same year the book was published and wouldn't see the success it would bring. The book was very quickly snapped up for a film adaptation and at one point had Kenneth Branagh directing with Kate Winslet starring, but there was very particular adaptation challenges with this book which might explain why it's had such a long production history, mostly because the book is a series of correspondences, its characters writing letters to each other throughout the entirety of it, so it's very hard to transplant that onto the screen. You can't literally have a film of characters writing letters to each other the whole time. We eventually have it brought to the screen in the form of Four Weddings and a Funeral director Mike Newell, and Lily James stars in the lead role. And considering the challenges of bringing this particular story to the screen, I think they've managed to do fairly well, all things considered, but not without a few caveats. This was a theatrical release in the UK and in certain other parts of the world, but in other territories it was acquired by Netflix. And I do think that this is the kind of movie that would likely benefit and would be best suited for that kind of format. The film is set just after World War II, where England is in a state of recovery. Things are beginning to get back to some form of normalcy, but at the same time there is constant reminders of what has just occurred and how events have been irrevocably changed, not least in the fact that there are constant streets lined with bombed out buildings, a certain reminder of the hardships they've had to endure over the past few years and the losses that they've suffered. Likewise, on the island of Guernsey, they've had to deal with the Nazi occupation. Both the Channel Islands were occupied by the Nazis, so not only did they have to deal with the hardships of the war, but they had to live alongside their enemies, and as such had to live daily with fear, hostility and suspicion, living under curfew and censorship. And also, they've lost so very much themselves. Not only do they have to live for the past few years without many children because of the evacuation, but also farmers found their cattle and many of their resources being diverted to the front lines, and thus were forced to grow potatoes instead, hence the infamous recipe featured in the film's title. And so if you look on the island of Guernsey, there are moments in this movie where they're walking on the beach and they see the turrets that the Germans had built, and that by itself is a reminder of their presence on the island. Even though that period has passed, it's still very recent history. It's still very, very raw. In the case of Juliet, for instance, she lost her family in a bombing raid, and so she has had to try and make up with that trauma, and so there is an early scene in this movie where she is looking for somewhere to live, and she has this traumatic flashback, essentially, and I think that embodies the spirit of the time. That's where the titular society comes in, and the film's main theme, that literature, as with any other form of media, can be liberating. It can be a form of great and necessary escapism, especially in periods of great hardship and crisis like the events in this movie, and it can bring people together as it does here. The group is largely created by accident. It's essentially a group of the islanders getting together to essentially share forbidden fruits with each other, things that they'd stashed away for their own ends, hidden from the Germans, and they share these great treats with each other, be it food or books. But it only becomes a society when they're wandering back that night and they're caught breaking curfew by the Germans, and to try and get out of that situation, the leader of the group, Elizabeth, essentially comes up with it on the fly. The name is deliberately elongated to avoid arousing suspicion, and in that way it becomes its own form of rebellion. And even though she doesn't have a whole lot of screen time in this movie, the society essentially becomes an extension of herself. Her presence is felt all the way through this movie, even after her disappearance. What it does is essentially gives them room at least once a week to express themselves in a way that they can't do elsewhere in their everyday lives. It gives them a sense of solidarity and purpose that helps them through very, very tough events as things get worse and worse for them, and food shortages eventually start to impact on the island and so forth. And yet, they continue to come together, they persevere with each other because of it, and I really enjoyed that because it shows what great works of art can do, in that they can really, really rouse people and they can stir emotions, and they are very, very necessary. This is a movie very much about storytelling, about what we discover in stories, the stories that we live in, the stories that we tell, and the stories that we write. That is where Juliet comes in. She deals, I think, with her grief and expresses that in her writing, and the way that she is very focused and determined on the particular kind of stories that she wants to tell. And I think that is what draws her into the group and why she finds them so fascinating. It's because she feels a sense of kinship and connection with them even before she meets them in person. And I think that's largely down to the fact that Dorsey writes about them so vibrantly in his initial letters to her. Like Juliet discovers for herself, being very much the audience surrogate, what viewers will likely discover is that what appears to be on the surface to be a bunch of lovable eccentrics banding together despite the strife of their everyday lives, it becomes something much more complicated and poses a lot more questions. Namely, what happened to Elizabeth? How did it happen? And where is she now? The story of the society is also that of the island, and Juliet sets herself the task of piecing together all the clues and trying to get to the bottom of the story of the society and asking them each individually about what happened. And that's always the question that hangs over this, is that as Juliet is learning more and more about this, the question in the back of her mind is this something that I can tell? It moves away from being this magazine article into something more deeply personal. It's not simply an assignment. This middle section of the movie should be where it's most compelling. It's the investigative part of the story. We're getting all these little snatches of information and we're trying to piece them together alongside Juliet. That should be genuinely engaging. Instead, I found my interest wavering somewhat. This is a fairly lengthy stretch of the movie, and as it continues, it actually drew me out of the movie, especially because I was ahead of it quite considerably. This might not be entirely the film's fault, I do have to admit, but I was aware and have seen another movie about Nazi occupation, not set in Guernsey, but in France. And I'm not going to name the movie just in case it provides a spoiler, But because of that movie, I had a sense of where the story was going, especially in regards with Elizabeth, and it turns out that my hunch was very much correct on that front. And so, in dealing with where the story goes, that was also a bit of a problem for me, because that particular element of the story, I don't think they really spend enough time on it. It brings up some very complicated issues that the framework of the story just simply isn't able to support. I think the main problem with this section of the movie is that it's extremely expository. You've got Juliet going to the characters who are all conveying these individual stories, and what you realise that they've done in adapting the book to the screen is that they've merely changed the way that characters talk to each other, essentially, in that they're no longer writing letters, that these whole passages have been transplanted into long monologues and flashbacks. Juliet spends most of the movie being talked to. This stretch of the movie very much feels like strings of constant exposition. It makes it feel a little bit more cinematic, but it does so on the most basic level, and I think that they probably should have tried maybe experimenting a bit more, or trying to do something a little bit different with the framework of these stories. It otherwise tells what was told in the book in a fairly unusual fashion, in a very straightforward way, and as such, it makes it significantly less interesting to watch, and it makes the story significantly less engaging because you get less sense of the voices than you do on the page. You know, even though that they're narrating these sections, there's still quite a bit lost in the translation from book to screen in this way that I think is to some extent inevitable. You're gonna have to deal with that, especially because of the way the book is framed. In casting Lily James, I think she's genuinely fantastic. I think that she very much has this kind of classical grace about her that makes her just perfectly suited for period and costume drama. Here, she has that kind of English resiliency in her, and she's so extremely spirited, and she's a real joy to watch on screen. She brings a lot of personality and presence to this character, which is both not only very welcome, but also, I think, very much needed, because Juliet in this story, not to say that she isn't an active character, but the problem with Juliet is that, as I said, she's a character to be talked to for large stretches of the story. The story does try to make up for this to a certain extent by placing Juliet at the centre of a love triangle. She has to choose between Michael Heisman's Dorsey Adams, who is this kind, generous man of the land that has almost stepped out of a romance novel, and on the other, you have Glen Powell as an American soldier that Juliet quickly becomes engaged to before she sets out onto the island. But despite that, she remains somewhat apprehensive. She's not sure if she reciprocates the feelings that he has for her, in spite of the fact that he has a fairly privileged, wealthy background, and he spoils her with enormous gifts that she isn't sure if she quite cares for. I did think that this is one of the lesser elements of the movie. It plays out exactly how you would expect it to, and I do mean beat for beat for beat, story element for story element. There's nothing really to throw you off the scent. There's no unexpected surprises in the way that the storyline unfolds. It simply tells it in the most conventional manner possible, which I think is symptomatic of this movie, in that it very much takes this story and it adapts it solidly but fairly unremarkably. Nevertheless, I do think that Heisman and James do have chemistry with each other, and she works well with Powell, but the latter isn't really given a lot to do here. He spends large chunks of this movie off screen. However, I am aware of the fact that this is going to be very subjective, because this is a romance after all, and I think that people coming into this movie from that angle, I think they won't have a problem with this. They'll be far more forgiving, because this is exactly what they want and expect out of this kind of narrative. Mike Newell does a fairly good job of balancing this movie. I think that there is There's something very comfortable about this movie. It's a very easy watch in a lot of ways, in large part because of the fantastic scenery in this movie. This is a gorgeous looking film, and it looks especially scenic. There is a bit of a catch though. None of that is Guernsey. All the movie is doubles, unfortunately. It was actually shot in Devon. It still looks incredibly beautiful, and they actually did a fairly good job, I thought, of managing to make that look convincing, that I was genuinely surprised when I discovered that fact, if a little bit disappointed, I do have to admit. But Noel does have a very good sense of the story's tone overall, in that it does feel like a fairly light movie, but it does touch on fairly substantial, darker moments, but they never feel out of place in the story, I don't think. What helps especially is that Noel has surrounded himself with a really wonderful cast. Particular highlights include Matthew Good as Juliet's gay publisher, who offers some deadpan wit and sage advice in a role which perhaps I wish was in the film a little bit more. You get the sense that he was a bit more of a major character in the book, because he would be the one that Juliet would be writing a lot of this information to. Instead, he pops up in the film sporadically, usually in phone calls to remind her of her publicity obligations. And elsewhere, you have Tom Courtenay, who adds a lot of welcome warmth and humour as the creator of the titular and really horrible potato peel pie. He actually conveys some of the more darker elements of the story in his narration. I think that when it's filtered through him, loses some of the potential tonal dissonance that those sections could have provided. But the one that really stood out to me was Penelope Wilson. She is heartbreaking in this movie. She is playing someone who has lost her daughter in childbirth just as the occupation started, and as such, she essentially adopted Elizabeth as this surrogate daughter figure, and thus she's perhaps lost more than anyone else, and you can feel the grief within her, and the pain and the guilt over not only losing her daughter, but also with Elizabeth, and her feelings are sort of bottled up, and as such, she can sometimes come across as being quite a cold character. She shuts down Juliet whenever she inquires something too close, something too personal, and yet across the film, those guards are lifted, and as we reveal more about her, you really get a sense of just how brilliant Wilson is. The sadness is palpable from her, and it really is the thing that I carried most out of this movie. She is utterly phenomenal in this film. Guernsey's a very easy movie to like. It's charming, and you could even describe it as cozy, with the laid-back pacing and the scenic visuals that make it very easy to indulge in. It's for that reason I think it's perfectly suited for Netflix, because even though this is a UK theatrical release and quite a successful one, this would be a very hard sell internationally, especially theatrically, because it's very much steeped in British culture and history. It's a movie that could get lost, but I think we'll find an appreciative audience on the service. And I did think while I was watching the film that I didn't need to be seeing it in a cinema. This could very easily play on a Sunday evening on BBC One. And so in that respect, it premiering on smaller screens, I don't think does the movie a disservice. In fact, the opposite is true. I think that many more people will discover it that way, and the film almost invites you to watch it casually, and those viewers will find something that they'll really enjoy, I think. So if you have the service, absolutely check it out. I mean, if it's not your cup of tea, why does it matter? You've got Netflix. And even away from the service, I think that I would give this a light recommendation. This isn't the kind of film that I would usually watch, but sometimes you need a movie that overall is quite pleasantly diverting. And that is very much an accurate description of Guernsey. The Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society is a charming and quiet movie that is comfortably enjoyable. An all-star cast including a well-chosen Lily James, an amusing Tom Courtenay, and a heartbreaking Penelope Wilson bring vibrancy and life to a film that does sometimes fall into lulls from the flashback-intensive narrative. Both the mystery as to the fate of Finlay's Elizabeth and the love triangle between James Heisman and Glenn Powell play out a little too obviously and predictably and don't fully engage, especially during a lengthy second act. However, the film is far stronger as a portrait of community as a means of overcoming the hardship and pain of war and the appreciation of telling stories, even those that are too painful to recount. It is the kind of movie that is best enjoyed curled up with a cup of tea in front of a roaring fireplace on a cool night, and is an ideal fit for Netflix, who are distributing the film in most of the world, where it will likely play better there than on the big screen. If you like this review, then you can correspond with me over at my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.
The Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society. Crikey, that's quite a mouthful.